Now, the President and the Secretary General both made references to very, very experienced speakers lined up for today. And the first panel is going to kick off in a moment. That will be moderated by our own very well-known Kamal Shah, partner at Stevenson and Held. He will now introduce his panel, and the formal discussions will kick off therefrom. Mr. Shah, you're now invited to take over.
Thank you very much, Julius. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Welcome to the first panel of this two-day conference. And I'm sorry we're not able to meet in person, but next year, all going well. The topic we have today is of the utmost relevance. It's a very hot topic, hotly debated, and I'm very pleased to be chairing this panel of really eminent speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. As we have seen in the pandemic, that collaboration and a uniform approach is key to achieving pretty much anything these days. And a collaborative Pan-African approach to investment and dispute resolution, in my view, is the only sustainable way of growth and prosperity which Africa is seeking and richly deserves. The Pan-African Investment Code, in its spirit, builds on that. And of course, the AfCFTA builds further on that. So really the core of our discussion today is whether the investment protocol, which has been awaited and is currently being debated, can propel the Pan-African Investment Code and bring alive the African dream of having one trading bloc to a reality when others around us are going through their own issues. We have an hour and a half today. 1 hour will be presentations by the 4 panelists, and then we have 30 minutes of Q&A. So please do type away and send us your questions. We'll try and address as many of those in the Q&A session at the end. We have a great team of panelists. They have excellent background in government, in private practice, in academia, and as negotiators, some of whom are negotiators on the topic we're talking about. So there's a huge amount of practical, legal, and academic experience. The introductions will be brief. You can read up their bios online and in your programs so that we have more time to hear from them, and I'll introduce them as they speak. The very first speaker is a fellow Kenyan like me, Dr. Wilfred Mutubwa, who's a partner at Mutubwa & Co. Advocates in Kenya. He's the vice chairman of the CIRB Kenya branch. He teaches at the Kenya School of Law and the Riara University. He's currently a member of the task force set up by the Chief Justice of Kenya. He has a huge amount of arbitration experience and mediations. And in 2017, he was recognized by IARB as one of the top 100 arbitrators in Africa. Last year, building on that, he was named as one of the top 50 rising stars arbitration personalities in Africa. Wilfred, over to you. You've got 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kamal, and I hope you can hear me, just to be sure. Thank you very much, Kamal, and thank you very much for the team for putting up together this very important conference in very difficult circumstances. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody from wherever you're joining us across the globe. I have 15 minutes. What I have done is that I have prepared a paper which I have shared with the organizers for purposes of disseminating to all the participants. I have also come up with a very short version of a PowerPoint presentation, which I will shortly share, which seems to consolidate my views on the topic this afternoon. And just to help us go through the discussion, I will put up I hope if I can be allowed to share the screen, perhaps.
Wilfred, go ahead. You can share your screen.
All right. Okay, the function has been disabled. Maybe when the host, if I am allowed to share the screen. Sorry. Let me
I'm
go
sure
ahead.
Ade will come to the rescue
At some point, but let me start nonetheless. Really, the discussion this afternoon is about investment integration on the continent. And investment integration on the African continent under the umbrella of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. The idea here, as Kamal has very well put it, is to try as much as possible to bring the African continent together in terms of trade and investment by creating a market. And in the marketplace, you then have traders, you have investors, you have consumers, you have regulators, and you have dispute resolvers like ourselves. The general idea behind the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement itself is to consolidate the various initiatives that have been in the African continent for over 50 years in terms of trade and investment regulation on the continent. So my task is very simple, to try and lay a basis for the discussions that are to follow. I think I'm now allowed to share, so give me 1 second. Let me share the screen. All right. Adeyemi, please allow me to share on this particular gadget, not the other gadget, which I had. But let me proceed with the presentation as I wait for that. So the background to this is that there is hunger across the globe for foreign direct investment. The idea of investment is about foreign direct investment. And the idea of the African Continental Free Trade Area is basically to encourage intra-Africa foreign direct investment, cross-border trade and investment within the African continent, to bring together the 1.4 billion Africans into a single market that is governed or is directed by one investment approach. So foreign direct investment is meant to spur economic development. So those are the assumptions that are made at the economic level, that investments are generally good for the social well-being of the state. So that a state that attracts foreign direct investment is seen to be a forward-looking state which is set to improve the social well-being of its members. So it also improves the balance of payments. A state that has investors is likely to attract foreign currency, which is important in international trade. So African states, most of which are developing countries, want to rely less on aid and other grants coming from multilateral partners and engage in meaningful commerce that will eventually improve not only their economies, but the international image and prestige. And therefore, African states coming together under this particular arrangement are making a conscious decision to say that we are ready for business, we are able to improve our own economies, but at the same time, we want to improve the image that we project to everybody else in Europe or America. So that at the end of the day, when foreign direct investment is hosted in Africa, it sends a message even to bilateral and multilateral partners, lenders, the IMF, the World Bank, the European Union, that Africa has a clear strategy, it has a clear proposal, it has a clear understanding of its investment priorities and its investment regulatory regime and framework. So the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is indeed one of the efforts that the African states have invested in an attempt to develop this particular focus. However, there are challenges which come with this. One of the biggest challenges you find with continental efforts in Africa, particularly in integration. Now, today we speak about investment integration, but Africans have been in integration efforts for at least 50 years. Investment integration goes hand in hand with trade integration. So most of the efforts made by Africans for the last 50 years have been towards trade and sometimes economic and political integration. Investment integration does not take a materially different route from what we have experienced. One of the biggest challenges you find with African investment, trade, or economic integration efforts is the fragmentation of efforts. Now, it is said that each African country is a member of at least 4 integration efforts. So there are at least 4 integration efforts, either economic, political, investment, or otherwise, which bind an African state. For instance, just take an example of Tanzania, next door Tanzania here. Now, Tanzania is a member of the SADC, the East African Community, the COMESA, and the East African Community, COMESA, and SADC at the very least. And they still have bilateral arrangements and multilateral arrangements with African countries and other countries outside the continent. What this then portends is to bring up what is known as the spaghetti ball problem. You see, the similar objectives, when you look at the COMESA Treaty, when you look at the East Africa Community Treaty, you look at the arrangements under the Southern Africa Development Community, you will see that the objectives of integration are largely the same. Now, when you look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and the East Africa Community Treaty, for instance, the objectives are similar, although they operate at different levels, one at a sub-regional level and another one at a regional level. Now, the effect of this fragmentation is that there is divided loyalty, so that you are not particularly sure that Kenya is committed to the East Africa Community or the common market for Eastern and Southern Africa, or the African continental effort. So this proliferation, the proliferation of regional and sub-regional arrangements in Africa, including other bilateral level arrangements, often lead to ineffective implementation. So because some and most of the investment arrangements that come under these regional bodies are optional. When you look at the East Africa Community, the East African Community itself presents to you what is called a model investment agreement to be adopted by its members. Every state, for instance, has its own investment plan, investment model law. You will then notice that when you look at the Southern Africa SADC region, you will see that they have the finance and investment protocol, for instance. Now, many of these protocols are made to be optional, meaning that they are not mandatory in terms of taking up by member states. And the fact that these particular arrangements are left to be optional makes them ineffective. Now, I don't know whether it is from legal history or tradition. Most people, if told to take something optionally, they do not think that it is important. So that mandatory may very well be seen to be important, and optional is seen to be less important or less of a priority. It is something which they are not bound to. The cost of administering these investment arrangements. You have a member like Tanzania, again, I'll give that example, who is a member of the SADC, member of the COMESA, member of the East Africa Community, and has its own bilateral arrangements with third parties. Now, they must then sustain these arrangements, and which frameworks usually are meant to be set out in certain bodies or with secretariats, with persons advising, with the task forces and teams which are supposed to implement, both at the national level, at the sub-regional level, or even at the regional level. Now, the history of the African Union will show you that most African states are slow, number one, in meeting their financial obligations to regional, sub-regional, or even international bodies. Today, as we speak, last year, perhaps last year and the year before, we have read news of the East Africa community struggling to meet its operational costs because of default by member states. The same case applies to the African Union. So when you have very many fragmented approaches to investment and trade regulation on the continent, you run the risk, number one, of dividing loyalty, dividing focus, and even dividing or spreading yourself so thin in terms of resources, with the possibility of making these particular efforts ineffective because of the unsustainability in terms of their financing. Many African countries, and you will see these across the board, we have had the Agenda 2063, we have the African Economic Community Treaty, you have the Pan-African Parliament, you have very many initiatives commenced by Africans. But again, when you look at the implementation of these strategies is either half-hearted, or Africans enter into arrangements which they have absolutely no intention of implementing, or if they implement those initiatives half-heartedly, or observe them in breach. Now, the difficulty with investment integration, and we have been told that the African Continental Free Trade Area began trading January this year. So we have put the cart before the horse. An investment integration framework like we are discussing today, which is the African Continental Free Trade Area Investment Protocol, has not yet even come into force, and yet trading has already commenced. Now, which one should have come first? It's a question of the chicken and the egg. Which one comes first? Do we need to set up the framework? Do we need to agree on dispute resolution? Do we need to agree on the rules of engagement before we start the engagement, or do we start the engagement and firefight or deal with the problems as they come along? Troubleshooting, as they call it in IT jargon. Again, African countries are not very deeply developed in terms of manufacturing or value addition to products. Many countries produce almost similar products, agricultural products, which are not value added, they are not processed. So our level of manufacturing is still low. As a result, most African countries are net importers. Again, the trade between Asia and Africa, for instance, is at a much higher level than the trade between African states, unless you're talking about African states which are geographically located in the same area. But the trade is largely between African states on primary goods, agricultural goods that are unfinished. Intra-African trade is put at about 15% there. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area is meant to spur this, or to improve this situation to about, it's projected to about 30% by the year 2030. But I dare say that this will only be possible if the investment integration that is envisaged by the crafters of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is supported by investment integration that is deeply entrenched, that is effective, and that is focused on developing actual or true free trade. What are my views on this? As I wind up, this is my last area. What needs to happen for investment integration in Africa to work? Number one, you need a mandatory continental framework. Now, my view is this: you are discussing the Africa Free Trade, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Investment Protocol, code, whatever it will eventually be called. And you have the Pan-African Investment Code, which has been in the works and discussion for some time now. When I look at these two documents, you are speaking of the same script in different languages. Why don't we convert what we have, which is the Pan-African Investment Code, into the Investment Code for Africa? In any event, you are targeting the same people, the same community, the same objectives, and the same mandate. Why do you want to reinvent the wheel? The idea here is we do not want a situation where we are splitting hairs, creating unnecessary parallel bodies which would address the same issues. In my view, number one, we must have a fusion of the continental approaches. Have the fusion of continental approaches, put your resources together, focus the resources in building the Pan-African Investment Code. You could call it the African Continental Free Trade Area Investment Code, but at the end of the day, the investment integration is brought together in a fused continental approach. Make this approach a continental approach that is mandatory. One of the weaknesses with the Pan-African Investment Code was to move away from a code that is supposed to be mandatory in terms of uptake by member states to one that is left to the election of the states. Now, experience has shown that when you have countries negotiating international agreements that are left to be optional or to be non-mandatory, the effect of those particular frameworks becomes less. Look at it this way. You want to put 55 countries in one market. You want to have 55 member states of the African Union trade across the borders without inhibition. Then country X in the north adopts the investment code and country Y in the does not adopt it because it is not mandatory. At the end of the day, when you are dealing with disputes, and that is what is important for us as arbitrators, you are looking at international disputes between members or between citizens of two countries, one which has adopted the protocol and the other one which is still prevaricating or has refused to take up the protocol in its full effect. Secondly, it is not going to be possible to achieve investment integration in Africa if we do not have true free movement of services. True movement of services. True movement of services means that a doctor qualified in Guinea should be able to practice in Nigeria. That a Kenyan lawyer should be able to practice in Nigeria without any inhibitions or with the least inhibitions. So if you do not have free movement of labor, then the African Investment Code, the African Continental Free Trade Area remains a mirage, and in fact a receding mirage. In free movement of services, you will see that transportation on the continent is very difficult. It is cheaper to travel from Nairobi to Dubai than it is to travel from Nairobi to Morocco, for instance. Those are realities that apply on the ground, and they affect investment, because investment is the movement of the factors of production in economy. One of the most important factors is investment or the labor, investment in labor. And some of us may not invest in anything else but provide our services. For instance, arbitrators. Arbitrators are providers of services who should be allowed to operate on the continent under this framework without any inhibition. The right of establishment, for instance, ownership of land and other properties.
Wilfred,
yes.
I'm sorry, would you be able to wrap up? Your time is up.
In 2 minutes, Kamal, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the right of establishment, the ability to own property, to own land, to own factors of production, equal standards and qualifications, university standards, for instance, qualifications between professionals, the African visa or the African passport, as they call it, should be made a reality. It is not enough to have heads of state having African visas, while businessmen and service providers do not have the passport, the African passport. Visa on arrival is good, but visa on arrival is an impediment on its own. You want to look at international African integration of the market, supporting anybody who would want to establish, who would want to provide services, who would want to get employment, freely move within the continent. So the approaches of harmonization and devolution are my last suggestions. I would suggest that beyond fusing the continental approach, we look at devolving, using the existing sub-regional bodies. When you have the African Continental Investment Integration, for instance, supported by the regional integration bodies, the East Africa Community, the ECOWAS, the OHADA, the SADC, all these sub-regional bodies must all feed into the Continental Investment Integration Framework. This is the process of devolution. So that disputes within the East Africa Community can be dealt with at that level, yet the similarity or the hierarchical order of things would put the continental investment system at the highest level, then descending or cascading into the sub-regional level and into the national level. This would also include dispute resolution by using sub-regional or regional dispute resolution or arbitration centers as focal points for beginning the discussion about investment integration and dispute resolution. I will rest there.
Thank you.
And take you back to Kamal. And thank you very much. I will be taking questions at the appropriate time. Thank you. Back to you, Kamal.
Thank you, Wilfred. Our next panelist is Stephanie Garcera, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the National University of Singapore at the Center for International Law. Besides her extensive academic activities, Stephanie has worked as a legal consultant for several governmental and NGO bodies, including UNCTAD, the African Union, and the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Of most interest to me and probably to all of you is that she has had extensive involvement in drafting and negotiating the Pan-African Investment Code, and she will share some of her experience today. She is also the co-author of several publications on the international investment regime for Africa and the Pan-African Investment Code. Stephanie, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair. It's a true privilege really to be on this panel with such distinguished practitioners. Let me also thank the organizers, the African Arbitration Association, and especially my former colleague from Geneva, Dr. Rukia Baruti. As Kamal mentioned, I had the privilege also to be part of the elaboration and negotiation of the Pan-African Investment Code. And the 15 minutes that I have, I will dedicate to briefly comment on the process of elaboration and negotiation of this important instrument. And second, I will highlight the points that were not controversial throughout the elaboration, and then come to the two very controversial ones before I conclude. Now, the elaboration of the Pan-African Investment Code surprisingly started relatively early. A mandate was given to the African Union Commission in 2008 already. I think the project then was somewhat not moving on very fast, but there were expert groups working on it and compiling African best practices, taking into account investment and trade agreements that are existing in the continent, of course, from the numerous regional economic communities. When I, and especially when Professor McCann Beng took over the lead negotiation team of the Paic, it was already 2015, and that was really the year where everything went very quickly. In 2015, we had two important expert meetings. When I say expert meetings, this means a group of experts that is composed of representatives of the RECs. Once again, we had academia, African academia, we had African private sector representatives. So I would say it was a group of about 15 to 20 experts really working on the draft that existed so far, and then shaping further the instrument. The follow-up was then that this draft was sent out to all the African Union member states, and this was about in September 2015. which was then the preparation of an extremely important meeting in December 2015 in Kampala, which was a continent-wide meeting, which was no longer at the expert level, but really delegates from the member states to come and to express their concerns, as well as where they agree with the draft. And on this occasion, really, one could gather where consensus building is possible and where indeed we have great divergence on a national as well as on a regional level. Now, what did then happen? Before I get into the substance of the instrument, the draft that was more or less agreed upon at the end of 2015 then went back to all the capitals and got to the level of ministerial level, right? And then the big question was whether it becomes a binding or a non-binding. And we heard from Wilfried, it should have been a binding, but that was really the part in 2016 that needed to be decided at the ministerial level. We, the experts, we suggested it should be binding. However, in the course of 2016, it first turned out that in spring that the instrument is approved. And then in November 2016, it had been adopted as a non-binding model investment treaty. And that's where we are now. And that's what we still have as a text. So the text was finished and translated into all the African Union languages in 2016. Now, let me move on to the non-controversial parts. And I'm gonna strike out 3 aspects. The very first one is it was not controversial that this instrument has to be a very strong instrument that promotes sustainable investment, that is an instrument that is able to trigger real-life sustainable development outcomes in African countries. So the Paic, and again, this was consensus, is an instrument that contains in almost all its provision sustainable development issues to some extent or another. It's not only in the preamble, it's really, we have a number of sustainable development exceptions. I come to it in a minute. We do have investor obligations, which makes it a truly sustainable development instrument. And the very first article of the Paic sets really the tone of the rest of the instrument. And it takes into account that yes, investment is needed, but it has to foster the sustainable development of each African Union member states, and in particular, the member state where the investment is located. So when we look then on investor obligations, it's also interesting that investor obligations was really a common ground between African states. This might draw from the fact that already the regions have quite strong investor obligations in their instruments. The Paic yet goes a step further, as it has a number of investor obligations in numerous areas. So for instance, there is a chapter that is called Investor Obligations, and you find aspects of obligations that turn onto corporate governance, social political obligations within the host state, prohibition of bribery, corruption, CSR standards, also related to the use of natural resources, and business ethics and human rights. The particularity of the Paic and other African instruments is that all these obligations are directly addressed to the investor. It's not a best endeavor provision that we find in many investment treaties of other countries outside of Africa, which are addressed to the contracting parties and which state the contracting parties commit to foster corporate social responsibility. But no, here we have really addressed directly to the investor in the sense that the investor shall do this and shall do that. So that is a particularity, again, for the Paic as well as for other African regional instruments. I'm thinking here of the new ECOWIC of 2018, SADC model has it, AAC model has direct investor obligations. We also have it now in some bilateral settings, for instance, in the 2016 Morocco-Nigeria BIT. My third point on non-controversial issues is on the scope bit of the Paic. It's an interesting current trend that globally investment treaties tend to have more liberalization aspects. That means investors are also granted pre-establishment rights. The discussion was there during the Paic negotiations, but there was consensus that the Paic should not cover pre-establishment commitments. There is in Article 4 a provision that explicitly excludes market access and pre-establishment commitments. Now, I think for the African continental free trade area context, it will be an crucial or important point to decide whether the protocol should also contain market access and how this interrelates with the other trade in services and trade in goods. There might be, since we're focusing really African integration, a reconsideration of maybe having a bit more of investment liberalization. That has to be seen. Now, let me move to maybe the most interesting part, which is the controversial points. And one controversial issue, and this is of no surprise of none of us, I think, is the fact that investor-state dispute settlement is not only controversial at the global level, it has been controversial in the Paic elaboration, especially during that meeting in Kampala. It became clear that African states have developed already, it was back in 2015, but at the time already, you know, that South Africa had just published its new investment bill. So there was strong opinion in the room of not having ISDS in the Paic. And then we also had a couple of countries having concerns and being a bit concerned by the fact that if we don't have ISDS, it affects the attractiveness of the country, and that would not be good in fostering investment flows. So among among those countries that were in favor of ISDS, there have been, however, procedural points that found consensus. For example, the exhaustion of local remedies was something that seemed to be widely accepted by the delegates of the states. It was also that there is a favor of having not a unilateral offer to the investor, but more on a case-by-case. Consent is given on a case-by-case. And lastly, there was a strong opinion in the room on having more Africans in the arbitral system, of promoting in arbitration centers throughout Africa. Now, again, it was so controversial that the time was running out in Kampala, and we had to put the provisions on ISDS into brackets. And that meant, of course, when the text went back to the capitals, that there was no consensus on the whole of the ISDS provisions, very much to our, it's not always good to have brackets, of course, when you elaborate the text. Now, lastly, and I'll be brief on that because we already heard Wilfried on it, a controversial point was indeed, should this instrument replace other existing investment treaties in the continent? We know there is a big spaghetti bowl, and so as experts, we are like just saying, you should address this point, and there should be a transition period maybe. If you have this as a binding instrument, what are you going to do with the old intra-African investment treaties? And don't forget, some of them are OECD models, so not even drafted and elaborated in the spirit of development and sustainable development. So that was an issue, and we fought hard on it. There is an Article 3 that you can check. It became really watered down, and it became a text. I briefly read it. It says member state may agree that this code replaces the intra-African bilateral investment treaties. So that's the best we got. I remember that I even, gave a presentation on how Europe is fighting hard on having the intra-European BITs replaced. So this was really one of the controversial points that I also wanted to highlight. And again, in the African context, we have the regional setting as well that adds a lot to the spaghetti bowl. So I think my time is running out, if I'm right. I come to the conclusion, and I think what I would like to read.
You've got 3 minutes. Sorry, yeah. Stephanie, you've got 3 minutes. Yeah.
Great. That's good to hear. So I can elaborate on the conclusion and pick up on the idea that Wilfried already mentioned, which is this this aspect of Africanization that I actually mentioned sometimes in my publications, which is that the Paic, as it was a continent-wide process, was beneficial in the sense that it led to consensus building. It led to a comparative analysis between the regions, going beyond your own region. And let's see, what ECOWAS is doing is similar to what is SADC doing, but not all the same. And this was a nice way of exchanging on best practices of the region. And I found also interesting to highlight that the Paic, it's true, the greatest limitation was that it got not being to be a binding instrument, but it had influence if you look at at certain instruments that have been adopted after. So again, the ECOWIC 2018, 2016 Morocco, Nigeria, the revised SADC model BIT, and I think the EAC model was also right after. So yeah, I think this is what I wanted to throw out as thoughts, and I hope it nourishes into our discussion. Back to you, Kamal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's fascinating fly on the wall insight, and I'm sure we'll have some questions later. Our next speaker is Jackson Kern, who is a counsel based in Addis Ababa with the Addis Law Group. He's an international trial lawyer and has acted as counsel across Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas for a number of sovereign clients as well as private investors. He's a frequent lecturer at various universities and institutions, including the Peking University School of Law, Addis Ababa University, the Catholic University of Peru, and the International Law Association, amongst others, including ICSID. He's the co-author of the title, Arbitrating the Conduct of International Investors. Jackson, over to you.
Thank you, Kamal. And of course, first the customary good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, wherever you may be. I would just begin by stating, if ever any views were to be expressed here today, such views are not necessarily the views of any clients of the Addis Law Group or any clients of mine. They seem to like it when I say that, so I've said it. The leitmotif is investor obligations. So first, touching briefly on the Pan-African Investment Code as starting point, as a framework for formulation of the Continental Free Trade Area Investment Protocol. So I will take the opportunity to offer a few further thoughts, to offer some views as to why the text of the code ultimately ended up in the form that it did. It has seemed to me, in the nearly 5 years of the code's existence, there is one point that has been quite often overlooked. So we all know by now that the code is declared non-binding. Further than this, the code would not itself textually establish arbitral jurisdiction to hear investor-state disputes, even if it were binding. We've just heard this from Stephanie. So rather, the code permissively sets out that the states may consent to such sort of arbitral jurisdiction if they so wish. It is thus little more than a truism, a simple affirmation, if you will, of this existing and inherent sovereign right. And to the present, it has now become an invitation to the African states, perhaps to give their consent in the form of the investment protocol. So that's on consent and jurisdiction. Looking to the merits, to the substantive rights granted and the obligations that would be imposed, under the Code, if we look to see where one might be guided by the provisions of the Code in this respect, what we find is, as measured by the paradigm of global treaty practice, let's say, over the past half century, quite extraordinary. That's because the paradigm has been, of course, the one-way street, a street in which substantive protections, substantive rights flow in favor of the investor only. But when one looks to the Code, one sees two things in rather stark relief. First, while certain investment protections have been preserved, including the most classic, perhaps the most classic in international law, the protection against expropriation, others, which investors have come to expect almost as a matter of right, the guarantees of fair and equitable treatment, first and foremost, the FET, as well as full protection and security, FPS, are nowhere to be found. Now, it's difficult to ignore the irony that by this choice, the African states would deny to investors of their African counterparties the guarantee of fair and equitable treatment, which has been afforded to Northern investors essentially, I'd say, since the time of independence. So in a rather perverse way, it's almost as if intra-African investors would be made to suffer for the African states' dissatisfaction with a generation's worth of arbitration results originating in the North and with which they have had quite simply nothing to do. And by the way, the Northern investors would continue to enjoy those protections in the absence of any parallel effort to alter or amend those other still extant North-South treaties. So that's the first thing that one sees, exclusion of FET and FPS. Second, the Code contains investor obligations and thus portends a definitive end to the one-way street. Provisions for investor protections are perhaps something less than fully formulated, but they are unmistakably intended to be more than merely aspirational or preambulatory. They are intended, conceived to be hard investor obligations. So in a certain sense, here the irony deepens. Northern investors may continue to enjoy FET, FPS, while being free of countervailing control on their conduct. Meanwhile, intra-African investors are denied FET, and not only this, they are saddled with burdensome obligations, so the argument might go. So we can see how one might plausibly suggest that this result risks constraining rather than promoting intra-African investment. Now, my friend and colleague Juan Kedani has written that this result is not a function of animus, but rather doctrinal confusion. In similar vein, I recently heard one official refer to an identity crisis in the Code. What is certain is that measured by these two features, the Code marks a fairly dramatic swing of the pendulum. So reduced investor protections paired with the introduction and inclusion of investor obligations. The observation I would like to make before moving on is that I believe this result in the Code is in large part a function of what I would call the multilateral negotiation dynamic, about which we have heard some again from Stephanie. So this has been extensively studied in the context long prior to the investment code. Much ink has been spilled, and it seems to me that the enduring paradigm of bilateral instruments is rather easily explained by negotiation theory. States with greater bargaining power and or the perception or illusion thereof were able to gain more favorable terms vis-a-vis a single negotiating partner. Put more bluntly, or put quite bluntly, capital exporting states were able to gain more favorable terms vis-a-vis capital importing states by playing them one-on-one. I'm talking about the history of bilateral instruments generally in investment law. So fasting forward to the present, I would simply suggest that this multilateral negotiation dynamic may be present in the Pan-African investment initiatives as well. the Continental Free Trade Area is, after all, not merely a multilateral instrument, but sort of a mega multilateral continental instrument. All of the 54 or 55 African states, minus the state of Eritrea. So to tie these strands together, the swinging of the pendulum we have seen in the Code, this does reflect an element of backlash, to be sure. Backlash against the status quo of the investment law regime, dissatisfaction with the jurisprudence of fair and equitable treatment, certainly yes. But dissatisfaction paired also with the reality of the mega multilateral negotiation dynamic we have today, uneven levels of economic development and capital accumulation across and within the very many African states. And this leads to competing objectives and interests in the crafting of an African brand, if you will, of international investment law. So in a sense, that's the bad news. The good news is that if we honestly acknowledge and confront this challenge, there may be a solution that presents itself. Indeed, has already begun to present itself. So here I return to investor obligations. They have history in Africa. Long prior to the Pan-African Investment Code, this is seen in numerous instruments of the African regional economic communities, which we unfortunately do not now have the time to survey, but with which many of you are, of course, intimately familiar. They are to date, I'm talking about the provisions on investor obligations, they are to date sort of perhaps under-operationalized, but they are there. I'm going to try to share just a few brief slides. Let's see if I can manage to do so. Are we able to see? Oh, no.
Yes, we could see it. It's gone now.
All right. I'll try a quick recovery, otherwise I'll simply proceed. Well, I'm going to go ahead and proceed without the slides. I think this is entirely my fault and not the fault of anybody else. So basically in the ARIA report, this is the Assessing Regional Integration in Africa, which is a joint report. Okay, I may have been able to recover this now. Are we able now to see?
Yes, we can.
Very good, very good. So in the ARIA report, this is Assessing Regional Integration in Africa. It's a joint report of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the African Union, African Development Bank, and UNCTAD. This one dates from July 2019. For the time being, this one is most current. And we can see here four pillars of dispute resolution, four pillars of foreshadowed investment arbitration in the African in the investment protocol of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So, and indeed, I now understand that these four pillars are, let's say, adopted as underpinning the negotiations. And we see there investor obligations, the third column, compliance with domestic laws, human rights, business ethics, environmental protection, rights of indigenous peoples, capacity building, anti-corruption, taxation, corporate social responsibility. You see there also under the investment protection pillar, the third point, there is a reference to fair and equitable treatment or to a possible alternative thereto. So perhaps something which might lead to greater legal certainty than we presently have at the status quo, something to bear in mind as I move forward through investor obligations. The fundamental suggestion that I wish to make here today is that perhaps the pathway forward for first reaching a mutually agreeable Pan-African instrument and thereby fostering intra-African investment, perhaps that pathway lies in seeking a more optimized point of balance as between investor rights and investor obligations. To me, this requires going beyond merely setting out in a meaningful way the host state's right to regulate, but requires actually justiciable investor obligations. And I'm going to here assume, particularly having gained confidence from Stephanie's comments, I'm going to here assume that the enfranchisement of investor obligations in international investment law first is a desirable thing. And indeed, as we've again learned from Stephanie, Africa seems to have now spoken on this point. So I'm going to take this to be settled, at least here in Africa. The focus is not upon whether or why investor obligations should or might be included, but rather upon how to achieve jurisdiction over the investor in the arbitral forum, how it might work in practice. I'm going to offer just a few brief words there. Kamal, could I kindly ask you just for a quick time check?
Sure, you've got 2 more minutes, Jackson.
All right, I will endeavor to wrap up.
Thank you.
The third and final slide here, this is also from the ARIA report on investor obligations. You see here the international investment regime historically imposed obligations only on host states, not on private investors. There's a citation there to Jan Posse 1995. I believe that's the infamous arbitration without privity publication. However, as underscored by the Pan-African Investment Code, international investment agreements may serve as vehicles for investor rights and also for their obligations, which could rebalance the regime. Investor obligations can be a source for claims against transgressing investors and for counterclaims by defending states. The right to initiate proceeding may be bestowed upon the home state, its nationals, or both. I believe, in fact, there is a small error there. I believe that's meant to be a reference to the host state. So the host state of the investment rather than the home state of the investor. The work that is here referenced is a book that I have co-authored with my friends José Daniel Amado of Peru and Marindo Rodriguez of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Just by way of very briefly foreshadowing the models to gain jurisdiction, which are over the investor, which are therein contained. The simplest one, mechanically, textually, would be sort of a contingent consent clause in investment treaties, whereby the host state's consent to arbitration of the investment protection guarantees or obligations is conditioned upon the investor reciprocally giving his consent to be submitted to any arbitration of the host state's counterclaim, as might be brought up on the basis of those investor obligations we have seen set out, for example, in that third pillar of the ARIA report. So that's by way of sort of a very brief survey overview. There are also possible mechanisms to sort of directly submit the investor to arbitral jurisdiction without needing to gain his express consent. This could be done by conclusion of the treaty containing text whereby essentially the states acting in their capacity as the investor's home state could simply submit their investors to arbitral jurisdiction by the act of effecting a cross-border investment. I wish I had more time to say more, but certainly at some point in the future, my hope is that some of these propositions may come to the fore. So coming back one final time to the merits, substantive rights and obligations. We've seen the pendulum swing of the Pan-African Investment Code, reduced investor protections, introduction of investor obligations. So I might suggest that one manner of converging and propelling the investment protocol of the CFTA may be to let the pendulum fall to the center of gravity, to seek a, dare I say, fair and equitable balance of investor rights and obligations. Perhaps a new Africanization of international investment law. So just in conclusion, I propose such a balance of investor rights, meaning of course the investor protections, plus countervailing investor obligations as not only sort of philosophically the right thing to do, as has been recognized here in Africa. So here in Africa, that debate is over. But here in perhaps a rare instance, a very rare instance in the world of today, this normative motivation to do the right thing coincides with practicality, because as a matter of policy, this may offer the way forward in negotiation of such a mega multilateral instrument with various capital importing and exporting interests present. So again, both across and within the very many African states, very diverse interests present in this conversation. And by letting the pendulum fall to the center of gravity, I believe that thus might we find the point of balance, optimization that may be acceptable to all. So at this time where the world casts about for a suitable model of reform, at this time where we have placed our planet also in peril, and my hope is that Africa might show the way by instituting protections, yes, protections against true abuse of investors, while also imposing hard obligations to ensure the very most responsible business conduct, and thereby deliver what is truly a protocol on sustainable investment for Africa. Those are my comments here today, and I thank you. Back to you, Kamal.
Jackson, thank you very much. Sorry to rush you. Our last panelist today is Nalamle Orleans Lindsay, who is the head of the legal division and the board secretary of the Ghana Investment Promotion Center. At the GIPC, she is responsible for providing legal advice and support to both local and foreign investors, as well as on the legal regime necessary to provide a responsive environment for investment in Ghana. Now is also the lead negotiator for Ghana's team responsible for negotiating bilateral investment treaties, and has led numerous negotiations with countries including Japan, Qatar, Mauritius, Canada, Turkey, Czech Republic, Morocco, and South Korea. So she has a real wealth of experience, as well as no doubt lots of air miles in the process. Now, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Kamal, and thank you for the kind introduction. And I've enjoyed the presentations made by previous panelists. I want to add that I'm a government lawyer. I was the country rep for the negotiation of the Paic, also currently part of the Ghana negotiating team for the investment protocol. But the presentation I'm about to make is my personal views and not the views of the government of Ghana or my employer. Okay, so the investment protocol presents a unique opportunity for African states to disentangle, as has been said before, the spaghetti bowl of intra-African IIAs, BITs, and regional agreements on investments. We're looking towards having a harmonized and preferably obligatory instrument. As been said before, the most recent attempt towards developing a harmonized model document was the Pan-African Investment Code, which is sadly non-binding. So the current negotiations toward an AfCFTA investment protocol gives us an opportunity to escalate the Paic from mere guidelines to an instrument that will be adopted and utilized by African governments in negotiating intra-African BITs, IIAs, and with other African governments. So from the perspective of one who has worked in government and talked a lot with other colleagues who work in government, I seek to offer some key considerations for negotiating the AfCFTA investment protocol. The first proposal is that there is no time like present. COVID pandemic hit us last year, but there are silver linings in this particular crisis because the COVID pandemic placed into startling relief the necessity of governments around the world to take bold and rapid action to mitigate the adverse effects of the pandemic, which threatened to cripple their respective economies. Now, these actions often went against the commercial interests of international investors, but there was worldwide acceptance that this had to be done to protect the economy and to protect the populace. Now, as the vaccine has come round and countries are trying to ease restrictions, we now see that there's a fertile ground for investor-state disputes of investors whose interests were harmed during the COVID regime seeking to bring actions against host states. But there is arguably now, more than ever before, a greater acceptance, both in Africa and around the world, of the state's right to regulate for public health, for safety, for security. Now, when we are negotiating out of these agreements, you get some pushback when you want to put forward provisions about right to regulate, investor obligations, seeking to balance the relationship between foreign investors and host states. Now with COVID and what has happened after COVID, it's the best time to push for the inclusion in the investment protocol of provisions to do with the right to regulate, investor obligations, and also a reasonable balance between the protection of foreign investor interest and that of host states. Again, many African countries have adopted the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and reflected these in local policy and legislation. Now, earlier attempts to infuse some of these SDGs, as has been stated earlier, somewhere in the Paic, but at the bilateral level, have also faced some resistance. But now, post-COVID, I believe that there's more of an acceptance of how important it is to have these SDGs in IIAs and in the investment protocol to make sure that investments on the continent are geared not only towards making profits for investors, but towards the sustainable development of African host countries. The second proposal is that the investment protocol gives an opportunity to leapfrog over the mire. Previous panelists have spoken about the spaghetti bowl, so I won't go into detail, but it's very clear that African countries accepted that there was a lot of confusion in this regard, and they have tried very hard in the past decade at a national level and a regional level to reform the IIA framework. Approaches have included a partial or complete opt-out of ISDS, termination of IIAs, crafting of new IIA models, and so on and so forth. Though these efforts were well-intentioned, it's clear that they have resulted often in a lack of unified purposefulness in the direction of reform across the continent. So the investment protocol provides an unrivaled opportunity for states to come to a consensus as far as practicable on the core principles of investment law that should be reflected in the investment protocol. So we're talking about MFN, national treatment, ISDS, right to regulate. As has been said before, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. The Pan-African Investment Code is, as far as I'm personally concerned, the obvious starting point of negotiation of the provisions of the investment protocol. Of course, we may look at some of the regional documents provided by ECOWAS, SADC, and COMESA and identify areas of convergence and commonality. As was said earlier by Stephanie, who went helpfully through the areas of convergence and commonality. Once we have this in mind, it's easier to start the negotiations toward this protocol, knowing where the flashpoints are in areas where most countries have a fair idea and agree on the direction the document should take. The third point is building the blocks of consensus. As someone who was involved in the Paic, I do recall very heated discussions and arguments about provisions that should be in it, those who shouldn't be in it, the wording, and a lot of time was spent. So from my personal experience and going into the investment protocol negotiations, I have about 4 proposals about how to get to that consensus and have an investment protocol that is preferably binding on African states and binding not only for intra-African BITs, but BITs to be negotiated with other states outside the continent. So the first is inbuilt flexibility. Now, there are 50 countries in Africa, which are vastly different from each other. We have behemoths in size like Nigeria, like South Africa, in their population, in their GDP. We have small island nations. We have countries which are categorized as least developed countries. So when you come to negotiations, thorny issues to do with key terms, what's an investor? What's an investment, for example, can take you weeks, months, years to wrap around what these definitions are. Issues like pre-establishment, performance requirements, ISDS are obviously thorny issues. Now, instead of running the treadmill about finding consensus and bringing all these parties together, it is proposed that there should be some level of flexibility in limited circumstances in the language for countries, depending on their vulnerabilities, economic strength, state of development, to have a phased-in approach into the document so that they could opt out of certain provisions depending on strict limited criteria, or allowed to come into the document in a phased approach. This will be subject to discussion and would help to bring some consensus to the document. The second issue is unratified BITs, unratified international investment agreements. It's rather curious that a similar number of African IIAs, whether with African countries or with non-African countries, are unratified. You look at the list, you can find on Untitled website, so many executed documents, but so many remain unratified. Ghana, for instance, has 25 BITs that have been executed, only 7 have been ratified. A likely rationale is that many of these documents were entered into as a demonstration of strong political bilateral ties rather than a driver for international investment. So now that negotiations have started towards the protocol, what happens to all these IIAs, BITs, which have been executed? Some go back decades. What happens to them? Now, as the negotiations are going on, there is a possibility that the other signatories may come back to say, you know what, let's get this document ratified. So I would argue that caution must be exercised in ratifying these documents in light of the prospective investment protocol coming on board, so that we make sure there's no dysfunction between ratified documents and the investment protocol. That leads to the next issue about current negotiations, because there are current negotiations going on BITs and IIAs. What happens to them? There has been no clear guidance that African countries should put a halt to their IIAs negotiations. But I would posit that because COVID put a chill on a lot of negotiations because they're only done in person. Now that this protocol is going on, it's possible that there may be some pressure on African states to lock in a less liberal or pro-investor provisions in current BIT negotiations. So I would posit that African countries should proceed with caution in their current negotiations, take into consideration the fact that a document will be coming out probably next year, which hopefully will be binding. You don't want a situation where you have challenges acceding to a protocol which is inconsistent with currently executed ratified instruments. It makes life very difficult. You can follow from the EU example where you have to now figure out what to do with current BIT. So if we proceed with caution, that challenge may be mitigated. The next point is managing expectations. In Ghana, for example, there's been a lot of media focus on the AfCFTA, about how wonderful it is, how it will spring companies out of poverty, countries out of poverty, increase employment, basically improve trade and investment, and the news there is very, very positive. However, when it comes to the investment protocol, we all know that it's a trite fact that there's no direct correlation between signing a lot of agreements between countries, a correlation between getting an upsurge in foreign direct investment. One is a document and one is something that's live. So we ought to look at what will actually increase trade and investment on the continent, apart from negotiating and signing these documents. The protocol negotiators should take cognizance of the barriers to FDI in Africa, such as lack of transparency, excessive bureaucracy, corruption, lack of harmonization of local investment legislation, and the like. We ought to find a way of tackling some of these issues as well, possibly through the investment protocol. We could have investment facilitation provisions in a document which would guide African countries and governments in attracting FDI towards sustainable development. My last point on this is capacity building. As said earlier, African countries are vastly different in their stages of economic growth. We have country representatives that are well-versed in negotiation matters. They've had a lot of negotiations on agreements. They've gone through a lot of arbitrations. They are well exposed to the issues out there. Other African states have far less exposure to international investment, law, policy, and current issues. Now, they're all coming together at the table to negotiate the protocol. So it's important for capacity building of all the country representatives on what the key issues are. What are the best practice issues? What are some of the key instruments that you could look at? You look at the Brazilian example, Indian example, NAFTA, Asia, Europe, about how they went through their negotiation of their investment instruments, the problems that they faced, and how they are currently going through resolving these issues. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. So that capacity building must occur prior and during the negotiations so that you don't have a skewed approach where dominant countries dominate the discussions, as it were, that you have an even keel in the negotiations and the interests of different countries around the continent are reflected in the document. So the first meeting of experts has taken place for the investment protocol. I can inform panelists and delegates that there's a lot of enthusiasm in countries about this document and the potential that it carries in sorting out the spaghetti bowl, in getting a consensus on investment when it comes to the guiding document towards evening out the confusion and the fractured framework of IIAs on the continent. We are looking at having the discussions till the end of the year, possibly till early next year before the document is finalized and sent to the AU for ratification. So the issues that have been discussed thus far are all being taken on board, and I'm sure a lot of the experts who are discussing these issues right now will be invited to also provide their expert advice to the country reps on how to move this process forward. So this is somehow almost at the end of my presentation, and I want to emphasize that there's a lot of enthusiasm in this document in moving the Paic from guidelines to a formal obligatory document that we can all accede to and use, not only for our intra-African BITs, but also for BITs and negotiations with countries outside the continent of Africa. So thank you once again for your attention and look forward to hearing and answering your questions. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Nal. That was fascinating. We have a few minutes for questions before the coffee break. Can I just ask you one question now, which is, the experience you've had in the current negotiations, has there been more governmental geopolitical solidarity post-COVID?
Thank you. So we're in the early days yet, so we are yet to get to the meat and the thick of things. But I think COVID has really changed the mindset of many African countries. When COVID hit us, we were faced with us being net capital foreign direct importers. You couldn't get access to a lot of drugs, medication, PPEs, and so on. So the idea that we need to come together as a group and negotiate in our interests as an African continent, I suspect is a very, very strong idea now, and that will carry us through the negotiations. So there's more consensus and more effort to build consensus, if I should say, now than pre-COVID.
Thank you. That's what I would expect and hope. Thank you. Stephanie, there is a question in the chat box for you. Would you like to just summarize it for the audience and give a short answer, please?
Yes, thank you, Kamal. Let me get to the question again. Just a couple. But the question, a question I was asked is on the USCMA, which is the new NAFTA. The question is very specific on the keyhole approach under this new treaty, which requires a consent for ISDS to be given in an investment contract. Because, as you know, there was the presidency of Donald Trump who was renegotiating the NAFTA, and ISDS sort of got out of it, at least when we talk about the relationship between Canada and the US. And my question that I got was whether this has been discussed in the Paic negotiation and elaboration. And the short answer is no. And the longer answer would be that we were running out of time. The day when we talked about ISDS was the last day of the meeting, and you would normally need so much more time to negotiate or discuss all these controversial issues. And as I mentioned, since it was so hard and so controversial, we had to bracket it. But this was an issue of timing. And I think this might also be a lesson for the protocol, because these controversial, legal, highly complex issues, you cannot fix them in a short period of time, right? There needs to be thorough legal analysis and discussion. And for the United States, we can be sure that they use their best lawyers at the US State Department and US trade representatives to figure something out. And there are indeed innovative and good approaches how to deal with ISDS. The only thing that we were touching upon during the Paic was somehow to find a consensus in a way that we could have annexes. And I think now you mentioned something like that. We could go in a direction where we had some opt-in, opt-out, because African countries have different red lines, and there might be a way, to find consensus in this way. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Wilfred, there is a question, I think, relevant for you. It's about the interaction between the agreement between Kenya and the UK, US, and whether it is in line with the AfCFTA. Would you like to say a few words?
Thank you very much, Kamal. I will try and say very little now. The thinking around agreements, whether they are economic partnership agreements, whether they are trade agreements or investment protocols, is about negotiating. So you have heard about negotiation theory and the multilateralism. You see, from where I sit, the very fundamental reason why states come together to form regional bodies so as to negotiate economic, trade or investment arrangements is so as to leverage on the advantages they have collectively. Now, one of the criticisms over the arrangements now proposed to the US and the one entered with the UK is that this undermines the ability of a state like Kenya to negotiate with the UK or negotiate with the US, are clearly larger, perhaps economically more stronger state in negotiating economic or trade terms. The idea has been that why are we not negotiating either as the East African Community or the Africa Continental Organ or the AU or the Africa Continental Free Trade Area? Why are we not negotiating from a position of advantage? We bring a bigger market to the table, we bring more possibilities, we also leverage much better as a larger body. Now, some people think that by going and seeking the authority of the East Africa Community and the AU to enter into these agreements, what we are doing is to undermine our capacity to enter into fairer deals. And as a result, we are undermining the effort which we are making at the continental or sub-regional level to enter into deals which are good for our specific economies. My thinking is, you know, negotiation is about diplomatic strength, the ability to negotiate on the basis of the strength of your economy. Now, if you come as Kenya, you may not be able to achieve as much as you would have achieved as a continent or as a sub-region of countries. So yes, in my view, there is also the possibility, as my colleagues have put it, where you have more deep-rooted, we have more advanced negotiators, people who have negotiated in NAFTA, people who have negotiated in the EU. We in terms of expertise in negotiating and being able to bring forward our abilities in the negotiating table, I think it is better if we went multilateral than if we went bilateral, as is done in the Kenyan situation. So again, as the opening remarks speaker said, at the end of the day, it is about building capacity. It is also about leveraging your own advantages. So if you build capacity at a continental level, you are able to negotiate much easier or get better terms from the US or from the UK or from the EU. My own personal view, I think, is that we were used to the arrangements under AGOA with the US. We were used to trade pacts with the EU and the UK. Post Brexit for the UK, it became necessary for us to also get into some arrangement. And because many of our trade partners, many of our regional partners were prevaricating, delaying in making that decision, and it became a matter of national interest, sovereignty, as said by Mr. Kern, it became necessary for Kenya to move forward. But I think the trade deal is somehow lopsided in terms of what we would have gotten had we engaged the UK at the regional or sub-regional level. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have run out of time. I have plenty of questions. I'm sure the audience has as well, but thank you all very much. It was a great start to the conference, and I hope you enjoy the rest of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much indeed.
Bayo, over to you, or Ade.